Tonight, a library. It stood on the Egyptian coast more than 2,000 years ago, and it is probably the most famous building in history that nobody can point to. We do not know where it was. We are not sure what it looked like. And the story most of us were told about how it ended is, on the evidence, not right. So tonight we will go slowly through what is actually known. There is nothing distressing here. You do not need to remember any of it, and you may drift off whenever you like. Let us begin with the city. Alexandria was new. That is the first thing to hold in mind, or rather to let float past. It was founded around 331 years before the Common Era, on a strip of land between the sea and a lake, at a spot with good harbours and no great city already in the way. It was laid out on a grid, with wide straight streets, which was unusual and impressive. Within a century or so it was one of the largest cities in the world, and the capital of Egypt under a Greek-speaking dynasty, the Ptolemies, who had taken over after Alexander's death and who ruled for nearly 300 years, ending with Cleopatra. The city had a lighthouse so large it became one of the wonders of the world. It had a harbour full of grain ships. It had Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Romans, and a great deal of money passing through. And somewhere in the royal quarter, attached to the palace complex, it had an institution that we call the library, and which its own people mostly called something else. They called it the Mauseon, the place of the muses. Our word museum comes from it, though it was not a museum at all in our sense. It was closer to a residential research institute, or an endowed college. Scholars were invited to come and live there, at the king's expense. They were given accommodation, meals in a common dining hall, exemption from certain taxes, and a stipend. In return they were expected to study, to argue, to teach a little, and to be an ornament to the dynasty. The library was the collection of texts that supported all this. It was probably not a single grand building with a domed reading room. That image is a 19th century painting, essentially. What the sources suggest is a set of rooms and colonnades within the palace quarter, with shelves and niches, and covered walkways where you could sit. The satirists of the period made jokes about it. One writer described the scholars as pampered birds squabbling in a cage in the muse's birdcage, fed by the king. That is a very recognizable joke about academic life. There was a second collection too, smaller, housed at a temple called the Serapeum in another quarter of the city, and it seems to have been more accessible to ordinary people than the palace one. The main library sat inside the royal compound, which means access was probably a matter of invitation rather than of walking in. It was not a public library in any sense we would recognize. It was the king's collection, kept for the king's scholars. What was actually in it? Scrolls. Not books, not codices with pages, but rolls of papyrus. Papyrus is made from a reed that grew in the Nile marshes. The pith is cut into strips, laid in 2 crossed layers, pressed, dried, and burnished, producing a smooth pale sheet. Sheets are glued end to end into a roll perhaps 6 or 10 meters long. You hold it in both hands and unwind with one while winding with the other. It is a perfectly good technology, and it has one important consequence for our story. A roll cannot be very long. A single work of any size takes several rolls. The Iliad might occupy 24 of them. So when ancient authors give us numbers of scrolls in the library, they are not giving us numbers of books. The figures they give vary wildly, which is itself a clue: 40,000, 200,000, 400,000, 700,000, depending on which writer you read and how long after the fact. Modern historians treat all of these with caution. The collection was certainly the largest anyone had assembled. Beyond that, the honest answer is that we do not know its size. How they got the scrolls is the detail I would most like you to have tonight, because it is so wonderfully high-handed. According to the physician Galen, writing some centuries later, there was a standing rule in the harbour. Any ship that docked at Alexandria had to declare any books on board. The books were taken, carried up to the library, and copied. The copy was then given back to the ship's owner, and the original was kept. The entries in the catalogue for these were apparently marked with a note from the ships. There is a related story that the library borrowed the official Athenian state texts of the great tragedians, put down an enormous deposit, made copies, then kept the originals and let Athens keep the money. Whether every detail of that is true is uncertain. But the attitude behind it comes through clearly, and it is not really about scholarship. It is about prestige. The Ptolemies were a foreign dynasty ruling Egypt and competing with rival kingdoms for cultural standing. Owning the words was a way of being the center of the world. Because they were collecting so aggressively, they ran into a problem that no one had faced before at that scale. How do you find anything? The answer was one of the genuinely great intellectual inventions, and it belongs to a poet named Callimachus. He compiled what were called the Pinarches, the tables. Its full title translates roughly as tables of those who were outstanding in every branch of learning, and their writings. It ran to 120 scrolls. It divided works by genre, then listed authors alphabetically, with a short biography of each, then their works, with the opening words of each text and the number of lines. It was, in other words, a catalogue with author entries, subject classification, and enough bibliographic detail to tell one work from another and to spot a forgery. Every library catalogue since is a descendant of it. The Pinarches itself is lost. We know it only from quotations. There is something quietly ironic in that, and the ancient librarians would probably have said something dry about it. The work that went on there was of two kinds. The first was textual. The head librarians spent enormous effort on editing Homer, comparing many different copies, deciding which lines were genuine and which had crept in, marking doubtful passages in the margin with small symbols. That editorial practice, the apparatus of marks and notes, is the ancestor of how classical texts are printed to this day. The second kind of work was scientific, and some of it is astonishing. Eratosthenes, who was head of the library in the 3rd century before the Common Era, calculated the circumference of the Earth. His method was simple enough to describe in a sentence. He knew that at noon on the summer solstice the sun stood directly over a well at seen in the far south, casting no shadow, while at Alexandria at the same moment a vertical rod cast a shadow at a small angle. From that angle and the distance between the two places, he worked out the size of the whole globe. His answer was within a few % of the correct figure. He also drew one of the first maps with lines of latitude and longitude, and worked out a calendar with a leap year. Others in that world, working in or around the same circle, did comparable things. Aristarchus of Samos argued that the Earth goes round the Sun 18 centuries before Copernicus, and was not believed. Euclid, who probably taught at Alexandria, set out geometry in a form still used in schools. Herophilus dissected the human body and gave us the first careful descriptions of the nervous system. It was a small number of people, in a small number of rooms, and the reach of it is difficult to overstate. Now the part everyone knows, or thinks they know. The library burned. One terrible night, a fire, and the wisdom of the ancient world lost in a few hours. It is a powerful image and it appears in films and speeches and school lessons. The evidence does not support it. There is no single catastrophe. What there is instead is a series of separate events, spread over 6 or 7 centuries, each of which damaged something, plus a long, undramatic decline that did most of the real work. Let us go through them slowly, because taken one at a time none of them is upsetting. The first is Julius Caesar. In the year 48 before the Common Era he was in Alexandria, caught up in a dynastic quarrel, and he was besieged in the harbour district. To stop an enemy fleet he set fire to ships. Caesar's own account mentions the ships. Later writers say the fire spread ashore and burned warehouses near the docks, and that a quantity of scrolls stored there was lost. Perhaps 40,000, says one source, though again the numbers move about. Warehoused stock awaiting export, quite possibly, rather than the library's own shelves. The clearest sign that the library survived Caesar is that people kept writing about it afterwards. Scholars continued to work at the Mausoleum for centuries. Emperors appointed members to it. Strabo, visiting a couple of decades after Caesar's fire, describes the institution as functioning. So whatever burned in 48, it was not the end. The next real blow was political rather than fiery. In the 2nd century before the Common Era, a Ptolemaic king fell out with the scholars of Alexandria, who had backed the wrong side in a family quarrel, and expelled a great many of them. They scattered to Rhodes, Pergamon, Athens. The library kept its scrolls, but a library is not really its scrolls. It is the people who know what is in them and why it matters. That expulsion, quietly, may have done more damage than any flame. Then came the slow attrition of funding. Under Roman rule, the dynasty that had paid for everything was gone. Alexandria remained a great city and a place of learning, but the extraordinary royal budget behind the collection was not renewed by anybody. 2 more events are worth naming, and then 2 stories worth setting aside. In the 270s of the Common Era, the Emperor Aurelian fought a war in Alexandria, and the royal quarter, where the Mausoleum stood, was largely destroyed. That is probably when the original institution physically ended. Later, in 391, a temple called the Serapeum, which had housed a daughter collection, was destroyed during religious conflict in the city. But the surviving accounts of that destruction, including by writers hostile to it, do not mention books being there at the time. The building had probably been empty of them for a long while. Now the stories to set aside. The first is the Caliph Omar, who supposedly ordered the library burned in the 600s on the grounds that its books were either redundant or heretical. That tale does not appear anywhere for 600 years after the supposed event, and historians of all backgrounds have long regarded it as invention. The second is Hypatia, the philosopher killed in Alexandria in 415. Her death was real and terrible. But she was not the library's last librarian, and the library was not there to be lost with her. So what actually happened is this, and it is a slower and more useful truth than the fire. Papyrus does not last. In a damp Mediterranean climate, a scroll might survive a couple of centuries at best before it must be recopied by hand, at considerable cost, by someone who has decided it is worth the effort. A library of that kind is not a vault. It is a fountain. It only exists as long as someone keeps pumping. When the money went, and the scholars went, and the institution's prestige went, nobody was ordering fresh copies. Texts that everyone still read got recopied and survive today. Texts that had fallen out of fashion simply were not, and quietly ceased to exist, one at a time, over centuries, in silence. That is how most of ancient literature was lost. Not violently. Through neglect and the ordinary decay of organic material. There is something almost consoling in it, oddly. It means that libraries do not usually die in a night. It also means the responsibility is not to guard against catastrophe but to keep copying, keep reading, keep the fountain running. That is a quieter duty, and a harder one. So we leave Alexandria as it probably was, on an ordinary evening, with the lighthouse lit and the harbour full of grain ships and a room of scrolls in the palace quarter growing gradually dusty. No flames. Just a long, slow, unremarkable fading, and somewhere in it, someone deciding which words were worth writing out again. Sleep well. Some things last simply because people keep saying them,